Okay, good morning, everybody. So we're at the start of ecology. I know that you don't have the note packages for this, but follow along, obviously, with the PowerPoints as we go through it as best as you can. Save the PowerPoint. You always have this video to go through again if you have to rewatch something, okay? All right, so today's just going to be a little introduction to the beginning of this unit. So there'll be some terms that we're going to go through, maybe some things you'll remember. So ecology and ecosystems is, I believe, in the grade 6 or grade 7 curriculum. So you've covered this already. So a lot of today, what we're going to go through is going to be very familiar, or sound familiar anyway. Okay, so first, what is an ecosystem? So an ecosystem is essentially a term that describes the relationships between the different species living in a particular environment. Okay, so the important thing to make note of here is that it's also, so not only the relationship between the species, but also with the environment itself. So this portion here, right? So we have the relationship between the living and non-living components of their environment. So a couple of terms here. So this term here, biotic. Okay, so anytime you see the prefix bio, think of like biology, right? So biology, bio is essentially discussing living things. So biotic is anything that is alive or actually was alive at one point. So something like, let's say, a dead plant. Okay, a dead plant is still something that is biotic because it was living at some point. A non-living or abiotic component is something that has never been alive, never will be alive, right? So for example, here you could have water, right? So water is non-living, air, soil, sunlight, right? So things that are non-living and will never be alive. So these terms you're going to see quite a bit throughout this unit. Okay, so what's an ecosystem? So it's the relationships between organisms and their environment, okay, and also between organisms themselves. So again, it goes back to this point here, right? So the relationship between living things and non-living things. Really, essentially, how does everything kind of come together in an ecosystem? So an ecosystem is essentially looking at all the living and on all the non-living components that happen to be there. Okay, so how do scientists monitor or look at ecosystems? Okay, so it's very difficult to monitor something that is alive and moving and always changing. So one thing that scientists tend to do is they will pick one or two indicators for an ecosystem. So what that means is usually it's a type of species. So for example, it could be, let's say we're looking at a forest ecosystem or a pond ecosystem. The species they may choose would be like frogs, or it could be a specific type of fish or insect or plant. Really something that they're able to monitor and look closely at. Now, the reason why I'm bringing frogs as the example is kind of nice for monitoring things because frogs both live in and out of the water. So meaning, let's say all of a sudden there's a drop in the frog population, that's probably going to indicate that something is wrong in that ecosystem or unhealthy. So it could mean that there is unhealthy, something is happening in the water or something's happening in the soil, right? Whereas let's say you pick a species of fish, fish might only indicate what's happening in the water, right? So usually scientists or biologists more specifically, or ecologists or who study ecosystems, they try to pick species that can look at more than one type of environment. So frogs eat mostly insects and small fish, right? So if frogs were completely wiped out, the insect population would increase dramatically. Yeah. So not only do they monitor the indicator species that they've chosen, but it's also like the repercussions of that, or kind of how does it affect other living things. So imagine, right, the frog population did go down. Okay, well, all of a sudden, the insects and the small fish population is going to go up because there's not as many frogs eating them. So when you're, and the opposite too, maybe the different organisms that eat frogs, maybe there's a large bird, a bird of prey, like a hawk or something that will eat a frog. If the frog population goes down, those populations might go down as well because there's not as many frogs to eat. So kind of every species has a interaction with other things that are in that ecosystem. You don't, very rarely do you see something that is living alone and doesn't rely on anything else. You'll see as we go through food chains and food webs, everything is really interconnected. Okay, so this just kind of goes back, I've already mentioned this. So there are many factors that can cause a species to be lost, okay, but typically it's indicating that there's an unhealthy ecosystem. So it could be, let's say there's something happening to their habitat, right? So maybe there is, this would be more specific, let's say an organism that lives in trees, let's say a squirrel, right? If all of a sudden the trees are cut down and there's no more trees for them to live in, the squirrel population is going to have nowhere to have their habitats. So they're going to have to either move to a different ecosystem or they may start to die, right? Maybe something has happened to the air or water quality or soil quality. Maybe the temperature is changing and they're no longer able to live in that environment. So there's many things. These are just a few points that I'm bringing up, but there are many things that could happen that can cause a species the population to go down. Okay, so what is ecology? So ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment. Let's see. Because remember, it's not just the living things interacting with living things. It's how do those living things interact also with the non-living components. So the habitats, the soil, air, water, temperature, sunlight. So there's many things that kind of go and interact with one another. So a new term, I've mentioned this term before, but we'll kind of give the definition of this here. So when do we refer to a population? Okay, so a population is looking at the same species that are living within the same ecosystem or habitat. Okay, so one thing I want to point out to you, we haven't talked about this yet. When we say the term ecosystem, ecosystems can be very small ecosystems, so maybe a pond or a lake. But ecosystems can be very big. Maybe an ecosystem we can talk about all of Richmond Hill, or we can talk about how all of Southern Ontario or all of Canada. An ecosystem can really even be globally, right? So we can talk about our world, our Earth ecosystem. So when we refer to an ecosystem, you just keep in mind that can be, it's not set, maybe you're always thinking of a forest or, an ocean or something, but it can really refer to anything where there are living things. So when we say the term population, that could be a population of, fish that are inside of a lake, right? Like a fish remember if we were to talk about the human population of Earth, right? We're talking about all the humans that live on Earth, or the mallard duck population in Richmond Hill, right? So this can refer to anything, but the key there is it's the same species. So when we're talking about, let's say, a duck, okay, well, like a mallard duck would be one type of species of duck, right? And I'm sure there's other species out there. Or same with fish, right? So we usually don't say like a fish population. You can say, the salmon population or the tuna population. Usually we're referring to a specific type of species. Okay, but that term population is talking about one type only. Okay, so when we're talking about all the different populations, okay, we refer to that as an ecosystem community. Okay, so an ecosystem community is now talking about all of the different types of populations that live there. So now let's say we're talking about a forest community. A forest community would be everything that lives in that forest. So it's all the different types of trees, all the different types of mammals, all the different types of insects and plants. Right? So when we say the term community, it's all of those collectives together. Okay, so every organism that is in an ecosystem has their own role to play, or their own kind of piece in their ecosystem puzzle. Okay, obviously we already mentioned that they interact with each other. So some have more of an impact on others depending on how the food chain is going. And we'll talk about food chains in the next upcoming couple of lessons. But no matter what, every ecosystem has organisms that have specific roles. Okay, so there is a term for that. So the role that an ecosystem, or I should say that a species has, is called a niche, N-I-C-H-E. Okay, so a niche, so an ecological niche is talking about everything, and this is the point here, everything that that organism will need to survive and to continue reproducing that population. So this can include everything from what does this organism eat? Where does this organism live? Where does this organism need to reproduce? Is there a specific area that they need to breed in? You know, a specific type of soil? Where, you know, not only what does it eat, but what eats it? You know, what type of organisms eat it? So it's everything that would be, you know, what type of nutrients does this specific organism need? So an ecological niche is very specific. Every organism has typically their own niche that they have to fulfill. Okay, but sometimes there is going to be competition for niches. Okay, so meaning you may have two or more organisms that are exactly in the same role. Okay, so this is where you start to have a problem. Okay, so when does this happen? So naturally, ecosystems do not have competition for niches. So let's say, you know, there's no human activity, there's nothing interrupting that ecosystem. Everything kind of has its own place. It's the circle of life. You know, everything will interact the way that it was meant to. Okay, but because of human intervention with ecosystems, we can start to have competitions. Okay, so what can happen is a new species can come into that ecosystem. So the term for this is called an invasive species. This goes by a bunch of other names as well. So sometimes they'll be called exotic species. Sometimes they'll be called non-native species. Ooh, my A there. Non-native. So meaning they're not naturally there in that ecosystem. So most of the time, this happens with human interaction. There are some occasions where you could have this happen naturally. So for example, let's say there is a hurricane and it devastates an ecosystem. So what happens is those animals or those living things that used to live in that devastated area have to find a new ecosystem to live in. So they'll basically migrate somewhere else, right? So that is a kind of a natural way that it could happen. Okay, but more so what happens is this second point. So humans, because they are traveling either by ship or by air or train, but because there's so much global movement, not only does that affect the spread of the coronavirus, just to keep things on topic, but what happens when humans travel globally is you also have exotic species that can make their way in. You know, so for example, in the barge area of the ship, so this lower part, you can have things that are kind of attaching themselves to the bottom of the ship. If you've ever seen a mussel or different type of crustaceans, right? They can go onto the inside of an airplane compartment or somebody's luggage, or maybe somebody actually brings the animals or whatever the species is with them without either with or without knowing it. So this is a big problem. We'll talk about this more in the second part. Because what's going to happen here is you're going to have a competition that's going to occur.